In the industrial heart of Birmingham, Alabama, during the winter of 1858, something occurred that would haunt the city's foundries for generations. A slave named Brutus Caldwell took a 20-pound sledgehammer and brought it down with such crushing force that his master's skull split like a watermelon dropped from a church steeple. Through the Sloth Iron Works, the sound echoed like a bell tolling for the dead. A wet, sickening crack that 17 witnesses would hear in their nightmares for the rest of their lives. What the authorities discovered in the aftermath wasn't just murder. It was evidence of a conspiracy so twisted and far-reaching that the city's most powerful men spent decades burying the truth beneath tons of molten iron and industrial smoke. The killing itself wasn't the real horror, it was what drove a man who had never shown an ounce of violence in 13 years of slavery to commit an act so savage that witnesses claimed they could hear the bones cracking from 50 yards away over the roar of the furnaces. The blood pooled so quickly that it began to steam and hiss where it touched the superheated metal of the foundry floor, creating a sound like serpents dying in fire. Before we continue with the story of Brutus Caldwell and the dark secrets of Birmingham's Iron Empire, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because stories like this one don't just disappear into history by accident. They're buried intentionally, covered up by men with power and money who understood that some truths are too dangerous to survive. And I want you to tell me in the comments, what state or city are you listening from? Because what happened in Birmingham could have happened anywhere in America, where men traded in human flesh and molten metal, where progress was built on the backs of the expendable. The truth about Brutus Caldwell's story begins not with violence, but with the rise of Birmingham itself, a city that didn't exist until 1871, but whose foundations were laid in blood and iron decades before its official founding. In 1858, the area was still just a collection of mining camps and iron works scattered across the mineral-rich valleys of Jefferson County, Alabama. The Cherokee had once called these hills home, their ancient burial grounds dotting the landscape like forgotten prayers. But by the 1850s, white settlers had discovered something far more valuable than farmland. The perfect combination of iron ore, coal, and limestone that would eventually make Birmingham the Pittsburgh of the South. The geography itself seemed designed for industry. Iron ore lay so close to the surface that miners could practically scratch it out with their fingernails, while vast coal deposits provided the fuel needed to fire the furnaces that would transform raw materials into the skeleton of industrial America. Limestone, essential for the smelting process, could be quarried from hillsides that rose like ancient cathedrals around the valley floor. It was a geological lottery ticket that would make fortunes for some and create hell on earth for others. At the center of this emerging industrial empire was Cornelius Sloth, a man whose ambitions were as vast as his cruelty and whose vision extended far beyond the cotton fields that had made Alabama's first generation of planters wealthy. Standing barely 5'6", with prematurely gray hair and eyes the color of winter ice, Sloth possessed the kind of restless intelligence that saw opportunity where others saw only problems. Unlike the plantation owners of the Cotton Belt, who were content to extract wealth from the soil through traditional agriculture, Sloth understood that the future of Southern prosperity lay not in crops that could be destroyed by weather or insects, but in the hellish furnaces that could transform raw ore into the iron that built America's railroads, bridges, and cities. Sloth had arrived in Alabama in 1847 from Pennsylvania, carrying letters of introduction from northern industrialists and a head full of ideas about how to adapt Yankee manufacturing techniques to southern labor conditions. What he found was a region rich in raw materials but poor in industrial expertise, populated by planters who viewed manufacturing as somehow beneath their aristocratic pretensions. While other men saw obstacles, Sloth saw the perfect opportunity to build an industrial empire using the one resource that Alabama possessed in abundance: enslaved human beings who could be worked to death without legal consequences. His foundries operated around the clock, fed by a steady stream of enslaved workers whose bodies were considered as expendable as the coal they shoveled into the flames. The Sloth Iron Works, established in 1855, quickly became the largest industrial operation in Jefferson County, employing over 300 slaves in conditions that made plantation fieldwork seem like a garden party. The furnaces burned at temperatures that regularly exceeded 2,000 degrees, turning the foundry floor into a landscape that resembled the biblical descriptions of hell. Workers labored 16-hour shifts in air so thick with smoke and metal dust that breathing became an act of will, their lungs slowly filling with the residue of industrial progress. The mortality rate among Sloth's iron workers was 3 times higher than that of field slaves. But Cornelius Sloth considered this an acceptable cost of doing business. After all, he could always buy more slaves from the failing tobacco and cotton plantations of Virginia and the Carolinas, but iron ore deposits were finite and precious. His business model was brutally simple: work slaves until they died, then replace them with fresh bodies purchased at the lowest possible price. It was an equation that reduced human beings to units of production calculated down to the penny per pound of iron produced. Brutus Caldwell arrived at the Sloth Iron Works in the spring of 1855, purchased from the estate of a failing tobacco plantation near Richmond, Virginia, for the considerable sum of $1,200, a price that reflected both his imposing physical strength and his reputation as a reliable worker who had never given his previous owners a moment's trouble. The plantation owner who sold him, a dissolute gambler named Harrison Kendall, had described Brutus as the finest piece of property I ever owned. Strong as an ox, smart enough to follow complex instructions, but not smart enough to cause trouble. At 28 years old, Brutus stood 6'3" in an era when most men barely reached 5.5 feet. His shoulders were broad as an ox yoke, developed through years of swinging axes and hauling timber, and his hands could grip a sledgehammer handle with the same ease another man might hold a dinner fork. His skin was the color of burnished copper, marked with the scars that came from 2 decades of hard labor. Old whip marks across his back, burned scars on his forearms from working too close to fires, calluses on his palms thick as leather. But it was his eyes that people remembered most. Dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to catalogue every injustice, every cruelty, storing them away like a careful accountant keeping books on a debt that would eventually come due. Unlike many slaves who had learned to make themselves invisible to their owners, Brutus possessed a quiet dignity that commanded attention even from white men. He spoke only when spoken to, but when he did speak, his voice was deep and measured, with the cadence of someone who chose his words carefully and meant exactly what he said. The work at Sloth Iron Works was brutal beyond imagination, designed to extract maximum productivity from human bodies with no regard for their long-term survival. Slaves worked 16-hour shifts in temperatures that regularly exceeded 120 degrees, feeding coal into furnaces that glowed like gateways to hell, hauling iron ore in wheelbarrows that weighed more than most men could lift, and operating machinery that could crush a human body in seconds if a worker's attention wavered for even a moment. Brutus was assigned to the sledge gang, the men responsible for breaking up large chunks of iron ore with 20-pound hammers before it could be fed into the furnaces. It was back-breaking work that destroyed most men within 5 years, leaving them crippled with ruined spines and lungs full of iron dust that turned their spit black and made every breath a struggle. The hammers themselves were works of brutal efficiency, their heads forged from the finest steel and balanced to deliver maximum force with each swing. A strong man could break ore for perhaps 6 hours before exhaustion made him useless. An exceptional man might last 8. Brutus Caldwell routinely worked 10-hour shifts without showing signs of fatigue, his hammer falling with a mechanical precision that other workers came to depend on. The rhythm of his work became the heartbeat of the foundry, the steady ring of metal on stone that meant all was well in their corner of this industrial hell. Other slaves would time their own work to the sound of Brutus's hammer, using it as a metronome that helped them maintain their pace through the endless hours of labor. Boom crack. Boom crack. Boom crack. The sound echoed through the foundry like a funeral drum, marking time until death or freedom came to claim them. What none of them knew was that every swing of that hammer was practice for something else entirely. Because Brutus Caldwell was planning something that would shake the foundations of Birmingham's iron empire, and his 20-pound sledgehammer would be the instrument of his terrible justice. The first sign that something was fundamentally wrong came not from Brutus himself, but from the other slaves at Sloth Iron Works, who began to notice subtle changes in their usually predictable fellow worker during the weeks leading up to December 15, 1858. Brutus, who had never been known to speak unless spoken to and who had maintained the same daily routines for over 3 years, started displaying behaviors that set off alarm bells among men whose survival depended on reading the moods and intentions of everyone around them. It began with questions, strange, probing questions about work schedules that Brutus had never shown any interest in before. He wanted to know which overseers would be where at what times, which areas of the foundry were visited least frequently by white supervisors, and which escape routes existed from different parts of the facility. These weren't casual inquiries, but systematic intelligence gathering conducted with the methodical precision of a military scout preparing for battle. More disturbing were the visitors Brutus had been receiving. In the slave quarters, privacy was a luxury that didn't exist. Every conversation could be overheard, every movement could be observed, every relationship could be monitored by informants looking to curry favor with their masters. But somehow Brutus had managed to arrange clandestine meetings with people that other slaves glimpsed only as shadows moving in the pre-dawn darkness, figures who approached through the woods surrounding the foundry and communicated through signals that none of the other workers could interpret. These mysterious figures left behind things that shouldn't have been in a slave's possession, sheets of paper covered with writing that Brutus would study by candlelight before burning to ash, small packages wrapped in oiled cloth that clinked softly when moved, and once, a leather pouch that contained what sounded like coins when it shifted in his hands. The presence of these items suggested connections to the outside world that went far beyond what a typical slave could maintain, relationships that implied resources and planning on a scale that frightened the other workers. Samuel Hutchins, a fellow slave who worked at the station next to Brutus, later testified that he had seen his friend writing in a small notebook using a pencil stub that had been sharpened down to almost nothing. When Samuel asked about it, Brutus had simply said, "A man needs to keep track of things. You never know when records might come in handy." The notebook disappeared during the investigation following the murder, but Samuel remembered that it was filled with columns of numbers and names written in handwriting so small it looked like ant tracks across the pages. December 15, 1858, dawned cold and grey over the Sloth foundries, with a winter storm blowing in from the north that coated everything in a thin layer of ice and made the already treacherous working conditions even more dangerous. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight, and the contrast between the freezing air outside and the superheated environment inside the foundry created an atmosphere that was both literally and figuratively explosive. Ice formed on the windows and walls wherever the building's heat couldn't penetrate, while the furnaces roared at full capacity to meet a rush order for railroad iron that Cornelius Sloth had promised to deliver before Christmas. It was the kind of pressure cooker atmosphere that had led to accidents in the past, men slipping on icy walkways and falling into molten metal, or collapsing from exhaustion and being trampled by their fellow workers who couldn't stop the relentless pace of production even to help a fallen comrade. The combination of extreme temperatures, hazardous working conditions, and impossible deadlines created a situation where human life became even more expendable than usual. At 3:17 in the afternoon, Cornelius Sloth made his daily inspection tour of the foundry floor, a ritual he never missed because it served multiple purposes. It allowed him to monitor productivity and identify potential problems, but more importantly, it was a daily demonstration of his absolute authority over every aspect of the operation. Sloth dressed for these tours like a general reviewing his troops, wearing expensive clothes that cost more than most free workers made in a month, silk shirts imported from France, wool trousers tailored in New Orleans, and boots made from leather so fine they gleamed even in the dim, smoky light of the iron works. His appearance on the foundry floor always created a ripple of tension among the workers, who understood that their master's visits often resulted in punishment for someone. Sloth had a talent for finding fault with the most diligent workers and a memory for grudges that stretched back years. He carried a walking stick made from polished hickory, not because he needed assistance walking, but because it served as both a symbol of authority and a weapon that he used to strike workers who displeased him. On this particular afternoon, Sloth was accompanied by two men who didn't belong in an iron foundry, well-dressed visitors wearing clean clothes and carrying leather portfolios that suggested they were there on business rather than inspection. The workers who noticed them whispered among themselves, wondering if these strangers were potential buyers, government inspectors, or something else entirely. Their presence added an additional layer of tension to an already volatile situation. What happened next was witnessed by 17 different people, but their accounts varied so dramatically that investigators would spend months trying to piece together a coherent version of events. What everyone agreed on was this. Cornelius Sloth was standing near the number 3 furnace, berating a slave named Samuel for working too slowly, when Brutus Caldwell approached from his usual position at the ore-breaking station. According to witness testimony, Brutus had been working steadily all day, his hammer falling in the same mechanical rhythm that had become the soundtrack of the foundry. But at approximately 3:15, he simply set down the chunk of iron ore he had been pulverizing, picked up his 20-pound sledgehammer, and walked with calm, deliberate steps toward his master. His movements were so purposeful and controlled that several witnesses later said they knew something terrible was about to happen, but they were frozen by disbelief and unable to intervene. "Mr. Sloth," Brutus said, his voice carrying clearly over the roar of the furnaces and the clang of metal on metal. His tone was respectful, almost deferential, giving no hint of the violence that was about to follow. "I got something for you, sir." Cornelius Sloth turned around, and that's when witnesses noticed something they had never seen before: genuine fear in their master's eyes. Not the momentary startle of someone surprised by an unexpected voice, but the deep, primal terror of a man who recognized death walking toward him. Sloth's face went pale, his walking stick trembling in his hand. And for a moment, he seemed unable to speak or move. "What do you want?" Sloth finally managed to demand, but his voice cracked like a boy going through puberty, betraying the fear he was trying to hide behind bluster and authority. Brutus raised the sledgehammer above his head with both hands, the 20 pounds of forged steel catching the red glow of the furnace flames. For a moment, suspended in that hellish light, the hammer looked like a piece of the devil's own fire, and Brutus himself appeared to grow larger, more imposing, as if he were channeling the power of every slave who had ever dreamed of striking back at his oppressor. "Justice," Brutus said, and brought the hammer down. The sound that followed was unlike anything the witnesses had ever heard, a wet, explosive crack that seemed to come from deep inside Cornelius Sloth's skull, followed by the dull thud of his body hitting the foundry floor. But Brutus wasn't finished. He raised the hammer again and brought it down a second time, then a third, then a fourth. Each blow was accompanied by sounds that would haunt the witnesses for the rest of their lives: the crunch of bone, the splash of blood and brain matter, the sizzle of human tissue hitting superheated metal. When it was over, there was nothing left of Cornelius Sloth's head but a spreading pool of blood and grey matter that hissed and steamed where it touched the hot iron of the foundry floor. The smell of cooking flesh mixed with the usual odor of coal smoke and metal dust, creating a stench that made several witnesses vomit where they stood. Brutus simply set the bloody hammer aside, looked around at the circle of horrified faces watching him, and said in the same calm, measured tone he had always used when addressing white men, "Somebody better send for the sheriff. I'll be waiting right here." The immediate aftermath of Cornelius Sloth's brutal murder sent shockwaves through Alabama's planter elite that reached all the way to the governor's mansion in Montgomery and beyond, into the highest circles of Southern society, where the implications of a slave successfully killing his master threatened the very foundation upon which their world was built. This wasn't just another case of slave rebellion; those were common enough and usually dealt with through swift public executions designed to terrorize other slaves into submission. This was different, more calculated, more terrifying in its implications for the stability of the entire system. Within 2 hours of the killing, Jefferson County Sheriff Thomas Whitfield arrived at the Sloth Iron Works with a heavily armed posse of 12 men, expecting to find chaos and possibly more bodies strewn across the foundry floor. Instead, they found something far more unsettling: a perfect order. The foundry was still operating at full capacity, slaves working their stations as if nothing had happened, while the blood on the floor near furnace number 3 was the only visible evidence that a man had been murdered less than 3 hours earlier. Brutus Caldwell sat calmly on a wooden crate near the spot where he had killed his master, his massive hands folded in his lap like a man waiting for Sunday service to begin. He had cleaned the blood from his skin and clothes using rags from the foundry, and his expression was serene, almost peaceful, as if committing murder had lifted some terrible burden from his shoulders. When Sheriff Whitfield's men approached with shackles and drawn weapons, Brutus offered no resistance, submitting to arrest with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout his years of enslavement. "I killed Cornelius Sloth," Brutus said when Sheriff Whitfield asked for his version of events. "I did it deliberately, and I'd do it again if I had to. I got no regrets about what I done." But when the sheriff asked him why he had committed murder, Brutus's answer sent a chill through everyone present, suggesting a depth to the crime that no one had suspected. "Ask his ledgers, Sheriff. Ask what he wrote in his private books. Ask what he did to the ones who came before me. Ask why 43 people went away from here and never came back." The other slaves had returned to work as if nothing had happened, their faces blank masks that revealed nothing of their thoughts or feelings. When questioned individually, they claimed to know nothing about any ledgers or private books, nothing about missing people, nothing about the systematic patterns that Brutus seemed to be referencing. They had seen the killing, yes, but they couldn't explain it. Brutus had always been quiet, respectful, hard-working, a model slave who had never caused trouble for anyone. The violence had come from nowhere, like a summer thunderstorm that strikes without warning and then moves on, leaving destruction in its wake. Sheriff Whitfield wasn't buying their act of ignorance. In his 15 years of law enforcement in Jefferson County, he had dealt with dozens of slave uprisings, and they all followed the same predictable pattern: spontaneous explosions of rage triggered by some immediate provocation, like a brutal whipping or the sale of family members. The rebellions were always emotional, chaotic, and short-lived, usually ending with multiple deaths and the complete breakdown of discipline in the affected area. But Brutus Caldwell showed none of the signs of a man driven to momentary madness by unbearable circumstances. His clothes were neat and clean. His voice was steady and controlled. His demeanor was that of someone who had carefully considered his actions and their consequences long before picking up that sledgehammer. This wasn't the behavior of a man who had snapped under pressure. It was the behavior of someone executing a carefully planned operation. The investigation that followed would expose secrets that Alabama's power brokers would spend decades trying to bury beneath layers of legal maneuvering and bureaucratic cover-ups. When Sheriff Whitfield and his deputies searched Cornelius Sloth's private office in the Foundry's administrative building, they found exactly what Brutus had told them to look for: a collection of ledgers, correspondence, and financial documents that painted a picture of systematic depravity that shocked even men who were accustomed to the casual cruelties that slavery made legal. The ledgers were works of meticulous record-keeping that reduced human beings to units of measurement and cost analysis. Sloth had been conducting experiments on his slaves, treating them not as valuable property to be maintained and protected, but as laboratory specimens in a twisted quest to maximize productivity while minimizing operating costs. The books contained detailed records of how long different slaves could work without food before their strength failed, how much weight they could lose before becoming unable to perform their duties, how many hours of sleep they required to maintain peak performance levels. There were charts tracking the effects of different punishments on work output, comparing the productivity gains from various forms of physical and psychological torture. Notes detailed which slave families could be most effectively controlled through threats to their children, which individuals responded better to rewards versus punishments, and which ones could be pushed to the point of death without significantly impacting overall production. It was industrial management applied to human misery, with slaves reduced to variables in equations designed to extract maximum profit from their suffering. But the most damning discovery was a series of correspondences with Dr. Josiah Nott, a mobile physician who was conducting research into what he called racial medicine, pseudoscientific studies designed to prove the biological inferiority of African Americans and justify their continued enslavement. The letters, written in Sloth's own hand and signed with his personal seal, revealed that he had been providing Dr. Nott with slave subjects for medical experiments, shipping them to Mobile in specially modified railroad cars and receiving substantial payments for each specimen delivered alive and in suitable condition for research purposes. The correspondence detailed a business relationship that had been operating for over 3 years, with Sloth serving as Dr. Nott's primary supplier of human subjects for experiments that ranged from surgical procedures performed without anesthesia to deliberate infections designed to study disease progression in different racial populations. The letters discussed the subjects as if they were laboratory animals, with clinical descriptions of their physical characteristics, health conditions, and suitability for specific types of research. Dr. Nott's payments were substantial, up to $500 per subject, depending on their physical condition and the type of experiments planned for them. The letters made clear that the subjects were never expected to return, with Dr. Nott describing his research as terminal studies that would advance medical knowledge at the expense of individual lives that he considered scientifically valuable but personally worthless. Sheriff Whitfield realized he was looking at evidence of systematic murder disguised as scientific research, but he also understood the political implications of what he had discovered. Dr. Josiah Nott was no backwoods quack operating in secrecy. He was a respected member of the medical community, a man whose theories on racial superiority were cited by politicians and judges throughout the South as justification for slavery itself. His research was funded by medical schools and scientific societies, and his findings were published in prestigious journals that shaped public policy and legal precedent. Exposing the experimental program wouldn't just destroy careers and reputations, it would undermine the scientific foundation that the entire Southern system depended on for moral and intellectual justification. If Dr. Knott's methods were exposed as torture and murder, then his conclusions about racial differences would be called into question, potentially undermining the legal and philosophical arguments that supported slavery itself. The sheriff made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life and change the course of the investigation in ways that protected the guilty while condemning the innocent. He confiscated all of Sloth's ledgers and correspondence, told his deputies that they had found nothing of importance in the office search, and ordered that all evidence of the experimental program be destroyed. The official report stated that Cornelius Sloth had been killed by a slave named Brutus Caldwell for reasons unknown, possibly related to a workplace dispute or personal grudge. But Sheriff Whitfield wasn't entirely corrupt. He was a man torn between his duty to uphold justice and his understanding of the political realities that governed his world. He kept copies of the most damaging documents, storing them in a tin box that he buried beneath the floorboards of his own home. He told himself he was preserving evidence for some future reckoning when the truth could be told without destroying the social order. But the deeper truth was simpler and more human. He couldn't bring himself to destroy the only proof that 43 innocent people had lived, suffered, and died in agony for the advancement of science and the profit of evil men. The trial of Brutus Caldwell began on January 18, 1859, in the Jefferson County Courthouse, a modest brick building with white columns that had been designed to project an image of classical justice, but would soon prove inadequate to contain the explosive secrets it was asked to judge. Under Alabama law, the outcome was never seriously in question. A slave who murdered his master would hang regardless of circumstances, motivation, or provocation. The legal proceedings were typically brief formalities that served more as public theater than actual trials, designed to demonstrate the state's commitment to protecting white lives while maintaining the fiction that slaves received due process under the law. But what should have been a simple proceeding that concluded within a day or two quickly became something far more complex and dangerous, threatening to expose secrets that some of Alabama's most powerful men had assumed would remain buried forever. The difference was Benjamin Carver, the court-appointed lawyer assigned to represent Brutus, a man whose background and principles made him uniquely unsuited for the role of providing token defense for a doomed slave. Carver was a recent graduate of Harvard Law School who had returned to his native Alabama with ideas about justice and legal ethics that didn't quite fit the Southern mold he had grown up in. The son of a small-town minister, he had been raised to believe in the fundamental dignity of all human beings, a philosophy that had been challenged but not destroyed by his exposure to the harsh realities of slavery during his childhood. His legal education in Boston had exposed him to abolitionist arguments and constitutional principles that were rarely discussed in Alabama courtrooms, giving him a perspective that combined Northern idealism with Southern practicality. At 26 years old, Carver was young enough to still believe that the law could be an instrument of justice rather than simply a tool for maintaining existing power structures. He had returned to Alabama hoping to build a practice that would allow him to support social reform while earning a decent living. But the reality of legal practice in a slave state had proven more morally complex than his Harvard professors had prepared him for. Court-appointed defenders of slaves typically offered perfunctory defenses designed to satisfy legal requirements without actually challenging the prosecution's case or the broader system that made such prosecutions inevitable. They entered pleas for mercy, collected their modest fees from the state, and moved on to more profitable work representing white clients in civil disputes. The expectation was that Benjamin Carver would follow this established pattern, providing just enough legal representation to satisfy procedural requirements while ensuring that justice, as Alabama defined it, was served. But Carver saw the case as an opportunity to test the principles he had learned about constitutional law and human rights against the realities of Southern justice. What he discovered during his preparation would transform not only the trial, but his own understanding of the system he had sworn to serve. Unlike other court-appointed lawyers who typically met their slave clients only minutes before trial began, Carver made multiple visits to the Jefferson County Jail, where Brutus was being held in solitary confinement. He spent hours listening to his client's story, taking detailed notes, and gradually uncovering a narrative that was far more complex and disturbing than the simple murder case he had expected to defend. What Carver learned during these jailhouse conversations challenged everything he thought he knew about slavery, justice, and the rule of law in Alabama. Brutus revealed that he could read and write, skills he had carefully hidden for over a decade because literacy in slaves was illegal and punishable by severe physical punishment. More shocking was the revelation that Brutus had been keeping detailed records of everything he had witnessed at the Sloth Iron Works, maintaining his own parallel accounting system that documented crimes the legal system would never acknowledge. Hidden in the slave quarters, sewn into the lining of a coat that had belonged to his father, Brutus had maintained a journal written in tiny, precise handwriting on scraps of paper scavenged from the foundry office. The journal contained names, dates, and descriptions of horrors that matched and expanded on what Sheriff Whitfield had found in Sloth's private records, but from the perspective of the victims rather than their tormentor. Brutus's records revealed the full scope of the experimental program in devastating detail. He had witnessed slaves being selected for shipment to Mobile, watched them being loaded into modified railroad cars that had been fitted with medical equipment and restraints, observed as they were drugged and prepared for transport like livestock being shipped to slaughter. More importantly, he had tracked the pattern of selection over 3 years and realized that his own name had appeared on the list for the next shipment scheduled for December 20, 1858, just 5 days after he killed Cornelius Sloth. "I wasn't murdering my master, Mr. Carver," Brutus explained during one of their meetings, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I was fighting for my life and the lives of every man, woman, and child in those quarters. Sloth was feeding us to that doctor one by one, like a farmer feeding chickens to a fox. And nobody was going to stop him but me. I knew if I let him ship me off to Mobile, there wouldn't be anybody left who understood what was happening or who could warn the others." Benjamin Carver found himself in possession of evidence that could potentially revolutionize the legal treatment of slavery and establish precedents for slave self-defense that might protect thousands of other people throughout the South. But he also understood that using such evidence could destroy his career, get him killed, and potentially make conditions worse for slaves throughout Alabama by triggering a violent backlash from the white community. The men implicated in Brutus's journal included some of the most powerful figures in Alabama politics and society, not just Dr. Knott and his medical colleagues, but railroad executives who had provided transportation for human cargo, government officials who had signed shipping permits without asking questions, and judges who had provided legal cover for the entire operation by ruling that medical experiments on slaves fell within the normal rights of property ownership. The solution Carver devised was as brilliant as it was dangerous, a legal strategy that would force the conspirators to expose themselves while maintaining plausible deniability about his own knowledge of their crimes. Rather than directly accusing respected members of the community of murder and torture, he would subpoena them as character witnesses for Cornelius Sloth, then systematically destroy their credibility through careful questioning about their professional relationships and business dealings. His plan was to use Dr. Knott's own arrogance against him, knowing that the doctor would be unable to resist the opportunity to describe his groundbreaking research in front of a courtroom audience. By allowing Dr. Knott to hang himself with his own words, Carver could expose the experimental program without appearing to make unsubstantiated accusations against respectable citizens. The strategy began working better than Benjamin Carver had dared to hope when Dr. Josiah Knott took the witness stand on January 23, 1859, expecting to provide routine testimony about Cornelius Sloth's character and reputation. Dr. Knott was a man accustomed to deference and respect, someone whose medical credentials and scientific publications had earned him a position of authority that he rarely saw questioned, particularly in Southern courtrooms, where his theories about racial inferiority were accepted as established fact. Tall and distinguished-looking, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that commanded attention in any room, Dr. Knott approached his testimony with the confidence of someone who believed his reputation made him unassailable. He wore his finest clothes, a black wool suit that had been tailored in New Orleans, a silk vest with a gold watch chain, and boots polished to mirror brightness. His expectation was that he would spend a few minutes praising Cornelius Sloth's contributions to Alabama's industrial development, then return to Mobile with his reputation enhanced by having helped ensure that justice was served. Under direct examination by the prosecutor, Dr. Knott painted a picture of Cornelius Sloth as a progressive businessman who had contributed significantly to Alabama's economic development while maintaining the highest standards of slave management. He described Sloth as a man who understood the value of healthy, well-treated slave labor and who had consulted with medical professionals to ensure that his workers received appropriate care. But when Benjamin Carver rose for cross-examination, the tone of the proceedings changed dramatically. Instead of accepting Dr. Knott's characterizations at face value, Carver began asking detailed questions about the specific nature of the medical consultations he had provided to Sloth, the types of treatments he had recommended, and the outcomes of various interventions. Dr. Knott, Carver began, his voice carrying a deceptively casual tone that masked the deadly precision of his questions. You described Mr. Sloth as someone who consulted with you about the medical care of his slaves. Can you tell the court more specifically about the nature of these consultations? Dr. Knott, unaware of how much Carver actually knew, began describing his research program in clinical detail, apparently believing that his scientific credentials would protect him from criticism. He explained how he had developed new techniques for studying human anatomy and physiology, how he had advanced medical knowledge through direct observation and experimentation, and how his work had contributed to a better understanding of racial differences that could inform social policy throughout the South. My research with Mr. Sloth involved the scientific study of Negro physiology, Dr. Knott said, using the clinical tone he employed in medical lectures. We were investigating questions of pain tolerance, recovery rates from various procedures, and the effects of different working conditions on physical performance. It was groundbreaking work that has already contributed to several published papers in respected medical journals. Carver allowed the doctor to continue describing his research methods, asking seemingly innocent follow-up questions that encouraged Dr. Knott to provide ever more damaging details. With each answer, the doctor revealed more of the horrific scope of his experiments, apparently believing that the technical language he used would obscure the reality of what he was describing. Can you tell the court more about these procedures you mentioned? Carver asked. What specific techniques did you develop? Dr. Knott, trapped by his own vanity, began describing surgical procedures performed without anesthesia, deliberate infections introduced to study disease progression, and amputations designed to test theories about racial differences in pain tolerance. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as the full magnitude of the atrocities was revealed through the doctor's own testimony. I developed pioneering techniques for amputation without anesthesia, Dr. Knott said proudly. My research proved that the Negro constitution responds differently to pain than the white constitution. I was able to perform procedures that would have been impossible with white subjects. When Carver asked about the source of his experimental subjects, Dr. Knott's answer sealed his fate. Mr. Sloth provided specimens of exceptional quality. His ironworkers were already conditioned to physical stress, making them ideal for endurance testing. I compensated him fairly for each specimen, and he guaranteed delivery in prime condition. The word specimen echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Even in a society that accepted slavery, there were limits to what people could stomach, and Dr. Knott had crossed those limits with clinical precision. But the revelation of Dr. Knott's experiment should have ended the trial in Brutus's favor. Yet the forces arrayed against him were too powerful to be defeated by mere evidence of atrocity. Within hours of the testimony, Benjamin Carver received visitors who represented interests extending far beyond Jefferson County. Judge Samuel Crawford called an unexpected recess and summoned both attorneys to his chambers. When Carver arrived, he found not only the prosecutor but also two men in expensive suits who identified themselves as representatives of the Montgomery Railroad Company and the Alabama Medical Society. "Son," Judge Crawford said, his voice carrying absolute authority, "you've made your point. You've shown provocation. But if you continue, you'll destroy institutions this state depends on." Dr. Knott's research serves a larger purpose. The railroad connections involve contracts affecting Alabama's economic future. The message was clear: Brutus would hang regardless of evidence, and continuing the defense would only destroy more lives without saving the one that mattered most. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Birmingham intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. That night, Carver's office was ransacked. His law books scattered, files rifled through, safe cracked open. Most importantly, Brutus's hidden journal, the only physical evidence of the selection list, was gone. But the burglars missed something crucial: transcripts hidden inside Carver's diploma frame, hanging in plain sight. On the morning of January 25, 1859, Benjamin Carver stood before the jury in the Jefferson County Courthouse and delivered the most important speech of his life. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with spectators standing in the aisles and spilling out into the hallway, drawn by rumors that something unprecedented was about to unfold. The air was thick with tension and tobacco smoke, and every eye was fixed on the young lawyer who had already shocked Alabama society by treating a slave's life as worth defending. But instead of the careful legal argument his colleagues expected, Carver began with a simple question that would expose the rotting heart of Alabama's power structure and force every person in that room to confront their own complicity in systematic evil. "Gentlemen of the jury," Carver said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the packed courtroom, "I want you to imagine that someone you loved, your son, your brother, your father, had been sold to a man who treated human beings like laboratory rats. I want you to imagine that this man had already fed 43 people to a doctor who cut them apart while they were still alive, studying their screams like a scientist studying the songs of birds. And I want you to imagine that your loved one was next on the list, scheduled to be shipped away in 5 days to suffer the same fate. What would you do?" The prosecution's objection came immediately. Judge Crawford sustained it with obvious irritation, but the question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Carver had violated every rule of legal decorum and courtroom procedure, but he had also forced the jury to confront the fundamental question at the heart of the case: when does murder become self-defense? And when does a human being have the right to fight for his own survival against systematic torture? What followed was the most systematic destruction of a conspiracy that a Southern courtroom had ever witnessed. Despite the theft of Brutus's journal and the obvious pressure from powerful interests to end the trial quickly, Carver had managed to preserve enough evidence to present a devastating case that would strip away the veneer of respectability from some of Alabama's most prominent citizens. He called witness after witness, railroad workers who had loaded the modified cars and wondered why they were fitted with medical restraints, government clerks who had processed shipping permits for medical specimens without asking too many questions about what those specimens actually were, even former employees of Dr. Knott who had quit their positions in horror at what they had been asked to assist with. The picture that emerged was of a network of corruption and cruelty that extended from the foundries of Birmingham to the medical schools of Mobile and the government offices of Montgomery. Cornelius Sloth hadn't been acting as a lone monster, he had been part of a systematic program designed to provide human subjects for experimental research, all under the legal cover of slave ownership and the moral justification of scientific progress. Each witness added another piece to the horrific puzzle, and with each revelation, the spectators in the courtroom grew more restless and disturbed. Men who had come expecting to watch a simple murder trial found themselves confronting evidence of atrocities that challenged their fundamental assumptions about their society and their own moral complicity in its crimes. The most dramatic moment came when Carver recalled Dr. Knott to the witness stand for additional questioning. The doctor, visibly shaken by the testimony he had heard from other witnesses, tried to maintain his composure but was clearly rattled by the systematic dismantling of his reputation and the exposure of his experimental program. "Dr. Knott," Carver said, his voice now carrying the authority of a prosecutor rather than a defense attorney, "you've heard the testimony of your former assistants about the procedures you performed. Do you deny that you amputated limbs from living subjects without anesthesia?" "I was conducting legitimate medical research," Dr. Knott replied, but his voice had lost the confident tone he had displayed earlier in the trial. "The procedures were necessary to advance our understanding of." "Do you deny that you deliberately infected children with diseases to study their progression?" "The research protocols were approved by." "Do you deny that you performed surgical procedures on pregnant women to observe the effects on their unborn children?" Each question hit like a physical blow, and with each evasive answer, Dr. Knott revealed more of the horrific scope of his experiments. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as the full magnitude of the atrocities was laid bare, described in clinical detail by the man who had perpetrated them. But the most damning testimony came from an unexpected source. Martha Sloth, Cornelius's widow, had been called by the prosecution to speak about her husband's character and his relationship with his slaves. She was expected to paint a picture of a kind master who had been brutally murdered by an ungrateful slave. But under Benjamin Carver's careful cross-examination, she instead revealed the psychological toll that her husband's secret activities had taken on their marriage and his mental health. Mrs. Sloth, Carver said gently, recognizing that this grieving widow held the key to understanding her husband's state of mind in the weeks before his death. Can you tell the court about your husband's behavior during the final months of his life? Martha Sloth, a small, pale woman in her 40s who had clearly been devastated by her husband's violent death, struggled to maintain her composure as she answered. He changed, she said, her voice barely audible above the silence of the packed courtroom. He started having nightmares. Terrible nightmares that would wake him up, screaming about sounds, horrible sounds that he said he couldn't get out of his head. What kind of sounds, Mrs. Sloth? He said they were the sounds that people made when they realized what was going to happen to them. He said he could hear them begging, crying, praying, but he couldn't make it stop. Tears were streaming down her face now, and several members of the jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Did your husband express any regrets about his business activities? He kept a loaded pistol by the bed because he said he was afraid they would come for him, the ones he had sent away. He barely slept, barely ate. He would sit at his desk for hours, writing letters that he never sent, talking about getting out of some kind of business arrangement before it destroyed us all. It was Martha Sloth who provided the final crucial piece of the puzzle when she revealed the location of her husband's personal safe, hidden behind a false wall in their home's basement. He told me about it just a few days before he died, she said. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should tell the authorities about the safe and what was in it. He said there were things that needed to come to light. Sheriff Whitfield, under direct order from Judge Crawford, retrieved the contents of the safe and brought them to the courthouse in a leather satchel that seemed to weigh more than its physical contents could account for. When the sheriff opened that satchel in open court and spread its contents across the defense table, the final pieces of the conspiracy were exposed for everyone to see. There were financial records that traced payments from Dr. Knott totaling over $20,000 across 3 years, shipping manifests that documented the transportation of medical specimens from Birmingham to Mobile, and correspondence between Sloth and government officials who had provided the paperwork necessary to move human cargo across state lines without interference. But the most damning piece of evidence was a letter written in Cornelius Sloth's own handwriting, dated December 10, 1858, just 5 days before Brutus Caldwell ended his life with a sledgehammer. The letter was addressed to his wife but apparently never sent, a confession of guilt and an expression of fear that revealed the true state of mind of a man who knew he was living on borrowed time. Judge Crawford ordered the letter read aloud to the court, and as the clerk's voice echoed through the silent courtroom, the full horror of the situation became clear to everyone present. Asterisk, my dearest Martha asterisk. Asterisk, I can no longer continue with the arrangements I have made with Dr. Knott and his associates. The money has been good, better than I ever dreamed possible, but the cost to my soul and my sanity has become unbearable. I know that what we have been doing is wrong, not just morally, but in the eyes of God. And I fear that divine justice will soon catch up with all of us. Asterisk. Asterisk, the big one, Brutus, has been watching me with those dark eyes of his, and I swear he knows exactly what I have been doing to his people. There is an intelligence there that frightens me. A patience that suggests he is planning something terrible. Asterisk. Asterisk, I have decided that after we send him to Mobile with the next shipment, I am getting out of this business entirely before it destroys us all. I pray that God will forgive me for what I have done. And I pray that you will never have to learn the full extent of my sins. Asterisk. The letter was signed and dated, providing undeniable evidence that Cornelius Sloth had planned to send Brutus Caldwell to Dr. Knott for medical experimentation and that Brutus had somehow become aware of this plan. In that moment, the case transformed from a simple murder trial into something far more complex, a story of a man fighting for his life against systematic torture, using the only weapon available to him. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a verdict that would be remembered as one of the most shocking legal decisions in Alabama history, asterisk, not guilty by reason of self-defense. Asterisk. It was a legal precedent that would have been unthinkable just days earlier, but the evidence presented had been so overwhelming, so horrific in its implications, that 12 white men in Alabama had been forced to conclude that a slave had been justified in killing his master to prevent his own torture and murder. The foreman of the jury, a prosperous cotton merchant named William Hayes, later described the deliberation process to a reporter from the Montgomery Advertiser. The question wasn't whether Brutus Caldwell killed his master, Hayes said. The question was whether any man, regardless of his color or station, has the right to defend himself against torture and murder. Once we saw that letter, once we understood what was really happening at that foundry, the decision became clear. If we wouldn't send a white man to the gallows for defending himself against medical torture, how could we in good conscience hang a Negro for the same thing? The verdict sent shockwaves through the packed courtroom and beyond. Spectators who had come expecting to witness a routine execution instead found themselves applauding a legal decision that challenged the very foundations of Southern society. For a brief moment, the humanity of enslaved people had been recognized and protected by the same legal system that typically treated them as property. But the celebration was short-lived. Within 6 hours of the verdict, representatives from the State Attorney General's office arrived in Birmingham with new warrants and additional charges designed to ensure that Brutus Caldwell would never taste freedom. The charges included destruction of property, conspiracy against interstate commerce, inciting slave rebellion, and interfering with legitimate business activities, legal technicalities that were dubious at best, but politically necessary to maintain the appearance that the state would not tolerate any precedent encouraging slaves to resist their masters. Governor Andrew Moore himself issued a statement within days of the verdict, declaring that while the jury's decision reflects the unique and disturbing circumstances revealed during this trial, the state of Alabama cannot permit any legal precedent that might encourage other slaves to take the law into their own hands. The defendant will remain in state custody while we pursue additional charges that reflect the broader implications of his actions. Benjamin Carver, his legal career effectively destroyed by his decision to mount a genuine defense of a slave client, spent the remaining years of his life working for the Underground Railroad. He used his knowledge of Southern law to help escaped slaves navigate the complex web of regulations designed to return them to bondage. And he maintained detailed correspondence with abolitionists throughout the North, providing them with documentation of the experimental program that would eventually be used as evidence in the broader moral case against slavery. The impact of Carver's sacrifice extended far beyond Alabama. Transcripts of Brutus's trial, smuggled north by Underground Railroad operatives, were published in abolitionist newspapers throughout New England, where they caused a sensation that reached the highest levels of government. The detailed testimony about medical experiments on slaves became part of the growing body of evidence that Northern politicians used to argue for federal intervention in Southern affairs, contributing to the political tensions that would eventually explode into civil war. Dr. Josiah Nott fled Alabama within a week of the trial's conclusion, but his flight only confirmed his guilt in the public mind. The medical community, faced with undeniable evidence of his atrocities and the public outrage that followed their exposure, stripped him of his credentials and banned him from practicing at any reputable institution. He spent his final years as a traveling patent medicine salesman, peddling dubious remedies to rural communities that didn't know his history. He died in 1873, penniless and forgotten, his theories on racial medicine discredited not by scientific progress, but by the courage of a slave who had refused to submit quietly to torture. The Sloth Iron Works continued operating under new management, but the foundry never fully recovered from the scandal that had exposed its darkest practices. Worker productivity declined as former slaves, now paid employees after the Civil War, refused to work under conditions that reminded them of the experimental program. The company struggled financially for decades, changing hands multiple times before finally closing its doors in 1971 due to foreign competition and changing technology. But the workers who labored there in later decades reported phenomena that suggested the past wasn't entirely buried. Maintenance crews working night shifts consistently heard the sound of a 20-pound hammer striking metal in the steady, rhythmic pattern that had once been Brutus Caldwell's signature. The sound would echo through empty buildings where no one was supposed to be working, continuing for hours at a time, always coming from a different part of the foundry, always stopping just before searchers could locate its source. These reports persisted for over a century, becoming part of Birmingham's industrial folklore and contributing to the foundry's reputation as a haunted place where the ghosts of slavery's victims continued their eternal labor. Some dismissed the stories as the product of guilty consciences and overactive imaginations, but the reports were too consistent and came from too many reliable sources to be easily explained away. Brutus Caldwell himself lived for another 37 years, spending them all in various Alabama prisons as the state found new reasons to keep him locked away whenever his current sentence neared expiration. But imprisonment couldn't break his spirit or silence his voice. He became a teacher and leader among his fellow inmates, establishing secret schools where he taught dozens of prisoners to read and write, skills that were still illegal for African Americans in many parts of the post-war South. More importantly, Brutus helped his fellow prisoners document their own experiences with a legal system that continued to treat them as less than human even after slavery's formal abolition. Under his guidance, former slaves and their descendants wrote detailed accounts of their experiences with sharecropping, convict leasing, and other forms of exploitation that replaced the chains of slavery with new forms of bondage. His influence extended beyond prison walls through letters smuggled out by sympathetic guards and visiting ministers. These letters, written in the same careful handwriting that had once documented the experimental program, provided guidance and encouragement to African Americans throughout the South who were struggling to navigate the dangerous transition from slavery to a freedom that often existed more in law than in reality. When Brutus Caldwell died on November 15, 1896, at the age of 69, his body finally worn out by nearly 4 decades of prison labor, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched during his long imprisonment. His final words, recorded by the prison chaplain who had become his friend and confidant, were characteristic of the man who had chosen justice over safety. "I did what I had to do, and I'd do it again. The only thing I regret is that I couldn't save the others who went before me." The truth about the experimental program was gradually suppressed through a coordinated effort involving state officials, medical institutions, and railroad companies that had profited from the transportation of human cargo. But the story refused to stay buried, as truth has a way of surfacing despite the best efforts of those who would prefer it remain hidden. The most important discovery came in 1987 during the renovation of a house that had belonged to Sheriff Thomas Whitfield. Workers found a tin box buried beneath the kitchen floorboards containing the documents that Whitfield had saved from Cornelia Sloth's office, ledgers, correspondence, and financial records that provided definitive proof of the experimental program and the network of corruption that had protected it. These documents, now housed in the Alabama Department of Archives and History, tell a story that challenges everything we thought we knew about American slavery and the capacity for ordinary people to become complicit in extraordinary evil. This mystery shows us that history's most horrific crimes are often committed not by monsters, but by ordinary people who convince themselves they're serving a greater good. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that Brutus Caldwell was justified in taking the law into his own hands? Could something like this happen again in modern America? Or have we learned enough from our history to prevent it? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries, because the most terrifying stories are often the ones that could be true. See you in the next video.